I invite you to stand for the reading of the Gospel in Mark 12:28-31. One of the scribes came near and heard them disputing with one another. And seeing that Jesus answered them well, he asked Jesus, "Which commandment is the first of all?" Jesus answered, "The first is, 'Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these." Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
I've been catching up and watching on Netflix NBC TV series called The Good Place. It's a story of a woman, Eleanor, who died and went to the good place. But there seemed to be a mix-up. She wasn't very good when she was on earth. She's trying to keep a low profile in the good place, but her presence seems to be wreaking havoc with the energy of the place. And so she wonders, should she tell someone that they've made a mistake? There is a popular view espoused by that show, that the good go to the good place, and the bad go, to the bad place. It seems to be an issue of math. You collect all the brownie points on earth that you can, then you get to add them all up, and you get a pass to go to the good place. And on first reading, that may well be what we suspect from today's readings. You click the 10 boxes of the 10 commandments, and you'll get all the points you need to go to the good place. That sounds simple enough. After all, it makes sense that we should be good, that we should follow the rules, that we should be obedient. That's what our moms and dads told us. If we wanted to do something against the rules and we argued to our parents, well, everybody's doing it, our parents would tell us to resist peer pressure and not do the bad things. Or my favorite is, well, if Jimmy jumps off the cliff, would you jump off the cliff? The system seems pretty clear. Every person for themselves. You stay on guard, and it's all up to you. That makes me tired and anxious just saying it. What a heavy load to carry. The entirety of my well-being, of my earthly and heavenly future hangs on the balance of whether I can have enough discipline to follow the rules and enough self-control to stay away from temptation? Yikes. I would present to you that a closer reading of today's two passages gives us a somewhat different perspective. Thank God. And I mean it. Thank God. Thanks only to God that could be possible. And I think the key comes in the difference between legal and loyal. As I was reminding you at the beginning of the reading of the Deuteronomy passage, the Hebrew people were in Egypt. They had traveled to Egypt. Think Joseph and the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. They had traveled there. They had done well in the country. They had prospered. But then there was a change. There was a new Pharaoh that came. And the Hebrews now were seen as enemies. And they were enslaved and abused. Think about last week's sermon when we heard about the brave Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. God calls Moses, and God delivers the Hebrews from Egyptian captivity. And it would be okay if you are picturing Charlton Heston in Ten Commandments. So here's the question. Did God liberate the Hebrew people because they were good? God hadn't given them the 10 Commandment check boxes. Not yet. And while they were enslaved in Egypt, many of them didn't even know who God was. Remember that from last week's sermon, that God had to introduce God's self to them? I would argue that God's liberating actions were done because of God's loyalty to the covenant that God had made with them generations earlier. God reminds them of that covenant in that introduction to the Ten Commandments, and also in the Shema when we hear, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone." And Moses reminds them, God made a covenant way back then, but not with our ancestors alone, but with us who are here alive today. This is a present reality. And the covenant is to be in relationship. And God would be loyal to the people, and the people would be loyal to God. Now then, Moses says, "Here are these commandments, which you will teach your children, which you will keep and obey, because of course you will want to. Because of course you are committed and you are faithful in this relationship. These are timeless words to live by." And there is no chicken and egg argument to be had here. God's love and loyalty come first. Then comes the chance to live a life along with these well-known parameters, these 10 commandments. See, these famous 10 commandments are really about our internal loyalty to God, leading us to external actions. It's not the other way around. It's not a competition to live by the legal letter of the word, the legal letter of the law, checking as many of the 10 boxes as possible while somehow not being concerned about the internal motivation of why we would do these things. That's why both Moses and Jesus, when they're talking about these, they begin with internal words. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength." And then Jesus quotes Moses from another passage and says, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." So if we were to be asking a legalistic kind of question, "Hey teacher, what's the lowest possible score I can get and still pass the test?" we're asking the wrong question. Our relationship of faith with God and with one another isn't a legal argument or a calculation to find the sneakiest of the loopholes of the law so that we can say that we're technically following the law, but still we get to do whatever we want, whether or not it violates the spirit of the law. No, this relationship is a journey of loyalty. And like I said, it's not our loyalty first, it's God's loyalty to humanity that comes first. And see, that to me is the crazy part. Because God is so intent on loving us and doing what God can to show us that. We humans are always making up excuses, and God is always modeling forgiveness and grace. And then eventually, things click. And we awaken to a sense of loyalty to God in our hearts, which I think is the seed of God's loyalty that is growing in us. And it is that internal loyalty which will lead us to love God with all our being and will lead us to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. For us as Christians, it is Jesus who makes it possible for us to finally be able to live up to the full potential we were created for. And this is the good news we celebrate today around the world. And we do so with this symbolic meal of participating in that act of recovenanting that Jesus had with his disciples, saying God was able to join us and connect to us first. So, what about these rules then? Yes, please follow them. Follow them seriously, follow them faithfully. But not because we have to follow them, but because it flows from our hearts to do so. Not because we're collecting points to get into the good place, but because we can't contain the joy that comes from knowing that we are in a covenant with God, a God that leads us to love God and to love one another. And for that we give God thanks. Amen.